Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Nick Kanoki, Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I'm very excited for our conversation with Rich Culbertson, an ALN Board of Directors member and a Senior Fellow. Before we get underway, we just want to thank our ALN Platinum organizational member, Onuma System. Building informed environments is their tagline there, and you can learn more at onuma-bim.com. Or watch some of the videos from our recent ALN BIM Storm series editions. We did one yesterday, a workshop, and you can find that on YouTube. Thank you also to our other ALN patron members, as well as all our organizational members who really make all our events possible. So thank you for the continued support, and reach out if you would like to join up and work with us. And with that, I will bring on Mike Bordenero, Executive Director for the ALN.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, that was quite a groundbreaking program yesterday, and it'll be featured in the next newsletter. And today we've got something that's pretty groundbreaking also. Our ALN board member, Senior Fellow, Rich Culbertson, he's also involved in ISO and ANSI and ASTM. He's well renowned for his knowledge of standards and their application in organizational operation to avoid risk and to maintain internal controls. And Rich, through a personal incident with his gas company, has gotten very deep into the methods by which utilities operate. And he's identified something that could be a systemic issue. All entities that have federal funds are required to report on their assets in order to understand how they need more funding. Well, our observation is that most organizations don't know what assets they have. So how are these utilities able to identify what they need if they're not able to validate through measured approaches what their existing assets are doing? And if they're not reporting properly, are they actually following federal regulations? So we are starting to take a new approach. We've been focused on benefits of asset management to promote the good things that can happen to your organization if you use a structured approach to asset management. We're going to start talking about the disasters that occur when asset management is not approached properly, the fatalities that occur. And we're still talking about the benefits, but we're going to start focusing on the very human issue of, does somebody have to die at this intersection before a stoplight is put up? And unfortunately, the answer is usually yes. And we don't want people to continue to die in gas explosions in order for utilities to apply a systematic approach to asset management. So, Rich, come on down. You can turn on your camera and join us.
Okay. And we are live right now, correct?
We are live. We've got a lot of people joining us.
Okay, great.
And hopefully we'll have some engaging chat or questions. Please put chat or questions. So Jack Kelly's already doing the chat. In other words, we're going to focus on risks associated with poor asset management. That's a great lead in, isn't it, Rich?
Oh, it sure is.
So Nick, will you share the slides that Rich has sent us? So how far is this from your home, Rich?
This is in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. This is probably about 30 miles from a house where I used to live. This is probably about 200 miles from where I live right now.
What was the issue here?
Well, what happened is that in May of 2022, there was an explosion of a home in Pottstown. So far, the reason for that explosion has not been determined. At the same time, 5 people died. And it destroyed about 2 houses, and also it killed 5 people. And it's a mystery of what happened. We know it's a gas explosion.
Is this
But-
the one where there were more than 100 calls to 911?
Oh, yes, it did. Eventually, a reporter in that area did a check of the amount of 911 calls made to this about smelling gas in that area. And for like the last 4 years, there had been something like 120 calls of people smelling gas.
Okay.
And so, but somehow, even though with all those calls, and people constantly reporting, yes, there's a smell of gas around here.
Yeah.
Apparently nothing was done. Then eventually
Okay,
the
Rich.
explosion occurred.
And as you said, 5 people died. And
Yes.
we don't want to be sensational, but we want to say that it's not just a pile of assets. Next slide, Nick. These are real people. And we wonder if there wasn't action done because of inequity. Would there have been a fix to a gas leak if it was in a more affluent neighborhood?
Yeah, and that's something of which we don't know. But one thing we do know is that the Public Utilities Commission thinks issues like this may take a year to resolve. But the fact is that it should not take a year to find out what the root cause
Exactly.
was, because obviously if you find the root cause, then you have a chance of preventing the same thing occurring to other portions of the neighborhood.
And next slide. It's not just that one incident.
No, here's Washington County in July 31st, 2019. Again,
Next slide.
but here shows the devastation of a gas explosion. Even you can see that how much energy does it take to rip a 2x4 apart, and there was glass, there were doors, there were nails strewn like 100 yards away, but you can see how devastating it was. Now there's a miracle though. There were 4 people that were injured in this. It's a miracle to me that those people lived.
Okay, so you can stop sharing the slide now. We wanted to provide visual evidence and impact of what goes wrong when there isn't a focus on asset management. And it's not just these 2 incidences. There's Massachusetts. We know that PG&E in California started using ISO 55001 after 5 people died in San Brenno in a gas explosion. And Rich is going to talk about some of the ways that focusing on improving asset management is a systemic way to address what appears to be a systemic problem.
Yes. When things like this happened, the question is, what was it? Certain explosions can be an act of God. Certain disasters can be an act of God. Act of God incidences may not be preventable. However, these explosions were not an act of God. These were caused by somebody, some organization. Something happened that was not supposed to happen, and somehow the controls that were supposed to be in place either wasn't in place, or those controls weren't working, or people weren't paying attention. And each of these, though, is that there's a major delay. You know, like the one in Washington County, that is still up before the Public Utilities Commission to determine what to do with the gas company in that regard.
So
On the first one, however, they have no clue who did it. You know, whether it's
so that's
public
another
utility gas
issue.
company or another gas company.
That's another issue about determining what happened. So what we want to focus is on preventing what happened through better asset management. And
First of all, what's supposed to happen with organizations? They should have an asset management function. Part of that asset management function should be risk analysis of determining, you know, what is the greatest risk we have that could hurt us. Well, for example, in in the gas explosions that occurred in Massachusetts with Columbia Gas in that area, it cost NiSource, the parent company, like $1.5 billion, and they were expelled from Massachusetts. So that's the, so when you take a look at a risk analysis as far as probability and the extent of the disaster, that's up in the right-hand corner. And so when, for asset management purposes, and risk and protection of assets, what are those possibilities and what happens if the disaster strikes because of an instance in that upper right-hand corner? And so when you look at that risk, particularly like in a triage function to determine what to do, those should be number one to prevent. And explosion is some of the worst things that can happen to a public utility that is a gas distribution company.
Now, through your personal experience with your gas company, and what we're talking about is not about one gas company. It's not about the gas utilities. It's about utilities that are serving the greater good of our citizens and how they should be following requirements from the federal government in order to avoid these types of disasters. And through your personal experience with the legal action in the state of Pennsylvania, you have come to understand how little asset management is being practiced. And we are making an assumption that that is going on at other utilities. Here in Illinois, there is a bribery case because our local electric utility was bribing public officials instead of meeting their requirements. Clearly, that's not the way to manage assets.
And that was the same thing for Ohio, had the same type of problems, you know, with a certain amount of what was determined to be corruption. But see, in asset management, a whole range of things has to be viewed and looked at and approved. You know, when I was working for Lockheed Martin, for example, you know, we were reviewed by the government, and to have an approved system, it took maybe 120 different questions that were reviewed, and also with samples and such. So in order to have an approved system, you had to do a whole lot of things right throughout the year. But see, that's the way with other companies too. In various organizations, you may have to do a whole lot of things right to have a good system. And in this case, what needed to happen, of course, is that they needed to really understand what they had agreed to, you know, for like the Securities Exchange Commission, that in fact, they had operated to internal control standards. And that is that they have effective, efficient operations that also protect assets. They have reporting that's reliable for financial and non-financial. And then they comply with laws and regulations and standards. Now, if an organization goes through all their elements in of their organization and asks those questions, is it effective and efficient? Is it provide reliable reporting? Is it compliance with laws and regulations? Then there's a tendency that those organizations will do well. Then if you don't look at the full picture, then bad things happen. And it's also, you know, a situation where we think of assets on the balance sheet, you know, being on the left-hand side. But when you take a look at the full organization, the entity level, as an ISO 55000 defines, is that an asset can be an item, a thing, or an entity. So in that particular case, you would want to take a look at the entity, but not only just the assets, but the liabilities.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's you're prescribing an approach for organizations, and that's great. I want to ground this in what you have found from investigating your own utility and what you have testified to in court and what is publicly available information.
Yeah, a lot of times what happens is that you don't
not
find
a lot of times, Rich, please talk about what you found specifically with your utility.
My problem with the utility, first, I bought a house. And they
Not the whole detail, not the whole. All right, so there's a reason that you got to court. When you were in court,
because I had a complaint against what I thought was wrongdoing against the public utility, where they abandoned my customer service line. But then when I started looking at things, it was not only one instance, it was a lot of different things within that organization that weren't working properly. And when things aren't working properly and people are not listening or people are not reacting or obeying laws and regulations that they're clearly applied to them, then it's almost like talking to a stone. And
So
it's not reactive.
if I understand correctly, you responded to a public comment session for $100 million rate increase. And you made a simple observation that the utility had not listed its assets. Therefore, how could the public know that they needed more assets? And the lack of properly listing their assets puts them in violation of federal regulations.
Yeah, but what happens with an organization, with public utilities, particularly gas companies? They're required to identify those assets that make up their overall distribution system. And they're also included to have maps of their distribution where they said to the federal government. And so those maps are supposed to work in an emergency. But if those maps are not correct, or if they're not complete, then again, bad things happen. You know, the incident, for example, in Massachusetts, maps were not corrected, and also the details were not adequate. They were operating on with paper rather than electronic. So there's a whole series of things that they were behind what would normally expect to be efficient and effective within those organizations, and where they would have an effective geo information system, you know, GIS. And so but when you don't have those things, and when a disaster strikes, people don't know what to do. And sometimes a delay. That delay eventually can cause explosions and fires and death. And that's what happened in Massachusetts.
And it's happened in many places. And
Right.
You're not saying that this is only your gas utility, that this is an issue probably for all utilities.
I think what we see is that like some utilities, for example, the gas utility and the electric utilities, are governed by accounting wise and controlled by the Department of Energy, but also coupled with the Department of Transportation. Under the Department of Energy, they issued their accounting standards. But some of those accounting standards came before what we recognize as GAAP today. For example, they say allowable cost, all costs must be reasonable, and it stops there. And of course, well, what does that mean? And of course, when that's not defined, then the person who is spending the money says, sure, what I'm doing is reasonable. I'm reasonable, therefore, when I spend money, it's reasonable cost. Well, it should not work that way. In other words, there are standards that based upon Office of Management budget, both in the FAR and as well as other regulations like 2 CFR 200 on grants that identify what in fact is a reasonable cost. And those things, those regulations by OMB and published, help organizations, not only just publicly traded corporations or governments, but every organization to help them what in fact is generally accepted. But if a company does not get the message with that and are trying to stay ignorant for their own benefit, then that creates problems. The public utilities commissions themselves are kind of an interesting entity in that, in most cases, from the very start of our country, it was recognized there needed to be a distribution of power, a separation of power. You know, the executive, legislative, judicial. Public commissions, those all are wrapped up in one organization. Those commissions have the ability to be prosecuted, they have the ability to have their own courts, and they have the possibility of making those final determinations, assessing fines, and even having certain police activities. But the problem with that, of course, is that when you have all power located in one area, and then when commissions are established appointed by governors, and most of them are patronage jobs, that there's really no way to assure that people are having those, that are commissioners, are in fact qualified and competent to do the work they're supposed to do. And that places a risk on companies, but also society, particularly in areas that we know that if you have proper accounting and internal controls in place, that's good. But if those things are not in place, then you end a disaster as far as overcharging customers, but also safety wise, things that are supposed to be done are just not being done.
And let's not divert too far, Rich, but in our preparation leading up to this, you pointed out that Silicon Valley Bank was missing a risk officer for a year. And
Yeah, again, I like to read how did companies fail? Because if we understand the history of how companies fail, then we somehow can avoid what they've done. Now, that's the Silicon Valley Bank, for example, that people say, well, two issues were there. It didn't have proper internal controls. Well, I believe, and I've believed for a long time, that good asset management requires good internal controls. And good internal controls requires good asset management. These work hand in hand, and it must be present within organizations. And in fact, we put that in ISO 55010, and then which is currently under review right now as well. But that's key and so important that make sure that those organizations are looking at what they're supposed to be looking at.
okay,
But the other thing with that, what was claimed is that they managed their asset side, but they didn't manage their liability side. And therefore, when your net worth goes down to less than zero, or your equity to zero, then that's when bankruptcy occurs, and that's what happened to them. But again, people are not paying attention to what was going on in the organization.
and that's basically what we're pointing out. And it's not just limited to utilities.
Oh no.
Public utilities are to serve the public, and there are rules and regulations in place that they should be following that should drive them to asset management. And of course, we're here saying ISO 55000 is a good tool to use when you're finally committed to asset management.
And the importance of that is that under ISO 55000, it encompasses both tangible assets and intangible assets. And so once it's recognized that even though an individual may have been managing tangible asset all their careers, now all of a sudden the whole thing of intangible assets come up. And when we take a look at what we think are the intangibles, it's like 90% of corporate assets are in the intangible areas versus the tangible. And therefore, intangible assets cannot be ignored. And now, for example, cryptocurrency, that is tangible or intangible. Well, it's not leading to a tangible.
So bringing it back to the utilities, there are regulations that they should be following. Nick, if you can bring up the slides with some of the existing documents that are required.
Yeah, one of the things that I've run across that also I think helps, that came out actually 2015. It had to do with the GAO fraud risk management. And it's important to realize what happened through all this COVID. How much was a result of fraud? Well, that's, from what I'm reading, that's like $200 billion of government agencies had spent money that may have been fraudulent or went to fraudulent organizations, including prisoners and those things. But somehow those organizations didn't read the GAO requirements as far as how you do that. Why don't you go to the next slide, because I think what's important on that fraud management area is I try, first of all, and again, read this. This is a very, very good document, but it only applies to fraud, but also applies to a lot of other things. And that is, first of all, put your efforts on prevention, then detection, and then response. And response can be whatever is necessary. It could be a correction or it could be whatever. But those three are key. But the most important one, in fact, is prevention. Now, they show there in the circles that prevention is larger, but it must, I think it's probably much larger. If you have a good prevention, then you don't have to worry as much about detection, and you certainly don't have to worry about correction. But those they're not equivalent legs. That needs to be really focused up front to make sure the prevention is there. When you look at those banks, that prevention is not there. They didn't have a risk manager, for example. and they weren't paying attention, you know, as far as the balance on their balance sheet, what they had as far as who owed what they owed or owned, and what other people and what they owed others. And here again, those internal controls can be in place where lights, bells, and buzzers go off when things go wrong. And those are the things that an organization must determine what are they and how to do that. And it's not impossible. It's just a matter of determining what kind of systems help manage that organization. And that's what ISO 55000 is about.
And there's one more slide that you wanted people to see.
Yeah. Right now, you know,
The
for
next
example,
slide, Nick.
right now, what's going on that may help folks is that the government, based upon laws back in 1946 that require, when government issues regulations and such, that they ask for public comment. And we are the public. We're public as individuals, but we're also public as entities. I know, for example, I've looked at the GAO Yellow Book, you know, the 2011, 2018 version, and now there's another one out there right now. And I've commented on each of these, and I expect to comment on this one, where the GAO is improving the Yellow Book. And part of that has to do with quality management and peer review. And that's a very good document. And I recommend reading it. And we will comment simply because we think we can improve it.
Okay, you can stop sharing this, Nick. And Rich is making a good point. So the ALN is going to be commenting. I'm sorry to interrupt you. What are we going to be commenting on, Rich?
It's going to be GAO Yellow Book, the next edition of it.
Okay.
And that's due like April 26th or something like that. You know, and it has a couple of things we will comment on, because it talks about the use of professional standards. Well, we believe in asset management, it's not just professional standards, but it's industry standards. It's the standards such as ISO 55000, ISO 9000. So those standards need to be in place to make sure that, and that's understood and that's integrated with internal controls, because internal controls does include compliance laws, regulations, and standards, because and the standards come from standards making organizations, and ISO and ASTM are both standards making organizations. The other thing there, it does comment on the use of other professions and experts in audits. That too would encompass asset management experts with that. And so we think that's a pretty good thing, and we'll support that. One thing I think it's also really important for people to understand is that most people think audits, you have to be a CPA and on all those things. Within the government, may not be a CPA, maybe just professionals in that. But at the same time, the only thing that the CPAs actually own would be internal controls over financial reporting. It does not necessarily own compliance with laws and regulations. It does not necessarily own effective and efficient operations and protection of assets. But all of those, however, asset management plays a real and vital role in that, because it's over and above financial reporting.
So the Asset Leadership Network is taking a new stance, and we're going to be starting to talk about disaster prevention by focusing on the failure of good asset management and how that has resulted in fatalities. And we want to prevent that. So we're going to be writing a paper. Mark Knight is started on this already, about disaster prevention through asset management. And we'll be working with Rich to inform that paper. We'll be using examples. So if people know of asset management disasters, please share them with us. It's not, we'd rather talk about the benefits, but we need to get attention on the subject fast. And so we'll be doing that.
Well,
So,
one thing, let me just
go
jump
ahead.
into that. On the GAO Yellow Book, what's good about that too is just not internal controls, but also the prevention of waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. So if you know those things are present, the best thing can happen is those things are discovered during audit. And when they are discovered during audit, that presents an opportunity for continuous process improvement.
ISO
And so-
55001, 10.3.
That's it. So they all, again, internal controls and ISO 55000 dovetail with one another. And it's really important to recognize they do dovetail. And when we talk about one, we also talk about the other because they strengthen one another.
Excellent. Thank you, Rich. Nick, if you can wind us up, then we'll end the official program. And I've been trying to get Rich to stay focused. We're going to stick around afterwards and we're going to just let Rich talk without me controlling them. But go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Rich, for being here today. And thank you to our Platinum organizational member, Onuma System, our patron organizational members, and all our organizational members for helping make this programming and the newsletter possible. And if you want to work with us, please reach out so we can figure out how we can collaborate.
And thank you all for attending. Yeah. If you've got other things, feel free to leave. Now I'm just going to take the restraints off. What do you really want to say, Rich?
Well, I think what I really want to say is asset management is very broad. And we and asset management experts, we should not have blinders on. It's not just the right documents, everything, but also promote good asset management. And unfortunately, sometimes when we see bad asset management, it's easy to remain passive because being active and try to change some of that is very, very difficult. It takes a whole lot of time. But the fact is, unless people get involved and point out, an expert point out the deficiencies of organizations, those things continue. I mean, for example, why would it take 125 calls to 911 about smelling gas, and somehow that wasn't corrected? Somehow the alignment between 911, public utilities commissions, fire departments, whoever, somehow didn't solve that. As a result of it, not solving it, people died.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't have been taking that long. And again, just take gas, for example. There are drones right now that can pinpoint gas leaks. That's a technology that's used.
They have
So it's not that
detectors.
difficult.
They
I'm
have,
sorry?
the drones are able to smell and they fly in areas and
right.
register if they smell gas. Okay.
Yes. Well, smelling and detect it, with certain rays or whatever that it's done that.
Okay.
That's being done, like in petroleum areas that use a lot of gas and refineries and chemical plants and those things. But see, those tools are available. And so when they're not used and they try to go back, and particularly when you have multiple functions who may be culpable, everybody runs.
Yes. So one of the things that you taught me about leads into what Jack Kelly is asking about. So you've basically taught me that public utilities receive federal funds, therefore they need to comply with Yellow Book and accounting practices. Those existing regulations point to asset management practices that should be followed. And those asset management practices include listing all of your assets and showing if they're sufficient for meeting the mission or insufficient. However, we can say that almost all utilities have assets they haven't identified, so they are not in compliance with federal regulations. How can public utility commissions be held accountable for accounting for their assets and managing them properly?
Well, I think, first of all, it's necessary that the Public Utilities Commission be held accountable to recognize they are under federal regulation, 2 CFR 200. Now that comes out of OMB. It's an OMB regulation. But if you receive grants over $750,000, then that organization is subject to them. All of the functions of that organization is function of those OMB regulations. And that includes both the Yellow Book, allowable cost, and the GAO Green Book. And so those are comprehensive documents, and they're very powerful documents. And I would say, even if an organization is not subject to grants, the information in those documents are powerful and also will help an organization to be successful and avoid failure. And also intellectually, it's really good to go through those documents to understand what they're saying, what the requirements are. So when you see what the requirements are and you observe what's going on, then you understand it. Well, it's okay or not okay. And it's not okay to violate regulations.
And Jack, to answer your question in another way, the Asset Leadership Network wants to increase promotion of the lack of asset management in public utilities, the lack of accepting ISO 55000, and point to these disasters as part of the proof that there is a lack of asset management, and try to raise awareness. And I'm sure there's utilities out there that would love to hear more about how they could improve, and they just need to be made aware of it.
Well, one thing I will say on somewhat defense of the Public Utilities Commissions. The Public Utilities Commission in Pennsylvania has 7,000 public utilities at which they co-supervise. So to be able to manage and supervise 7,000 public utilities, whether it be sewer districts or water districts or various, or communications or taxi cabs or whatever, that's a big job. But the fact is, you have to have the management tools and vision to be able to solve that. All those things are solvable, but they have to recognize they must manage them and not say, well, I'll just take a triage and not manage it. Very many of them. And again, that if you don't do the right things, don't turn out okay. Particularly on things like if you skip audits, you don't have an audit when audits were required of you since 1968, then your condition may not be very well that serve the public. And that's a condition of the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission. They have not done their own audit since 1968.
Okay, so we can refine our thoughts and bring them to the public utility associations and see if we can get Rich on schedules for presenting at National Public Utility Association events. I think that would be good.
But we have to find ways in which we can be effective. And sometimes that it takes time to do that.
So David Brewer asks if the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis also fits into this public utility disaster. Yes, definitely. And last week we talked with David Totman, and David Totman was pointing out after the fact all of the asset management issues that could have been addressed to prevent it, because he was part of the team that studied it. So I hate to promote disasters, but I think that's the way we're going to get people's attention.
Well, the biggest thing in our lives, but also organizations, is to prevent self-destruction. And we have responsibilities not to self-destruct.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rich, for sticking around and adding a little more clarity to this. And please, anybody who is interested, reach out and help us with this white paper that will be listing disasters in order to bring attention to improved asset management.
I appreciate everybody being online and the topics brought up. And Mike, I appreciate you and Nick for asking me and trying to make this as good as we can do it.
Yeah, and I should say that this week is because last week Rich was quoted in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on this issue, and so he's public now and can say things that might not have been appropriate previously. So Thank you, Rich, for continuing your service to the public.
Thank you.
And thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Okay, goodbye.